I love it.
All right, the first thing today is we're going to go over the answers to Millikan page 5, which is a crossword puzzle. So we'll go down through and give the answers, and if they have them written in below, that's fine. If not, you have to look at the crossword puzzle to find it. I think everyone wrote it in the blanks, so that'll be the easiest way to check it. All right, number 1, who is the Confederate president, Brady?
Jefferson Davis.
Right. Number 2, if I go too fast, does anybody have to look at the crossword puzzle? Everybody has the answers written below? Okay. Crossword puzzle just to help get the right answer. What? Yeah. Thanks. Okay. Well, let me know if I do go too fast, but I think you should be able to keep up if they're all written in on the blanks below the puzzle. All right. What was the Confederate capital, Sally?
Richmond, Virginia.
Correct. And who was the Confederate officer whose last name was Jackson? Nate?
Stonewall.
Right. Number 4, who proposed the Anaconda Plan? Stephen?
General Scott.
Right. Number 5, the Confederate commander at Manassas was who? Jill?
General
Beauregard. Yes. Number 6, who was the officer who rejoined the Union Army, having worked at a store in Ohio for a while and got the hankering to get back into the Army? Alex?
Nathaniel.
Number 6?
Oh, sorry. U.S. Grant.
Yeah, yes, U.S. Grant. Number 7, who was the Union officer killed at Wilson's Creek? Megan?
I think it says Legion.
Legion? No, that wouldn't fit.
Lion. Sorry.
Lion, yes. L-Y-O-N. Number 8, another name given to Confederate troops. Do you have a question, Caleb?
Yeah, the person I'm grading, they had the wrong one for number 3, like written, but they have it right on the crossword.
Oh, okay. If they have something wrong below, look up in the crossword and see if they may have changed it when they went up there. Okay. Well, the crossword is what really counts.
All right.
Okay, number 8, another name given to Confederate troops. Sarah? Right? Rebels. Number 9, who joined the Confederacy because of state loyalty? Lydia?
Robert E. Lee.
Correct. Number 10, the river that separated Union and rebel territory was what, Joey?
The Potomac.
Right. Number 11, who was president of the Union? Haley?
Lincoln.
Right. Where was the first major victory for the Confederacy? Steph?
Bull Run.
Right. And 13, after the Battle of Bull Run, the South chose a new battle, what?
Flag.
Right, flag. All right, count the number that are incorrect and put it at the top. Circle it if it's just to make sure that it stands out. I think what I'll have you do is when you turn in the next assignment for which you need the back of this to read, I'll have you turn this paper in too. The grader, put your initials beside the score as the grader in case there's any question. Yes.
How many points off did you say then this if they forgot their name?
It's after we get a score, it's -10. So you just circle name on there in pen if possible, so that that can't be erased. As quickly and quietly as possible, let's return the papers to whom they belong. If there's no name, we'll have to wait and see who doesn't get one.
Would you get
No name? Start giving you a name tag.
That's
Any questions? All right, put those away then. Your assignment for tomorrow is to use the backside of this page, obviously. through page 9, read 6 through 9 in Milliken, and do page 11, part 1. Today we want to continue looking at the battles in 1862. And we're going to come up to a second battle where it all began, and that is Manassas or Bull Run. This painting shows Brigadier General Jeff Stewart in June of that year, leading his troops. So an impressive painting there. There are several people that have done really good work in painting scenes from this war. Morse Kunstler is the artist here, and his works are really good, and a couple others that are shown along the way here. All right, so we're coming up to Second Manassas Bull Run, which is in August of 1862. The overwhelming advantage held by the I'm sorry, Steve, turn off lights so we can see this better. Turn them all off, let's see. Yeah, you guys got enough light.
Yeah, we have.
All right. The overwhelming advantage held by the combination of McClellan, Pope, they are the generals that are leading the Eastern Army here, had to be overcome by daring strategy on the part of Lee. Lee knows he has a lot less men and a lot less to draw on if he loses these men. So he's got to use his thinking abilities, his strategy, in order to figure out ways to defeat the Union Army. This is what he did. Lee sent J.B. Stewart's cavalry to raid Pope's rear. Pope is the one that's commanding the forces here that's attacking Lee at Manassas or Bull Run. And so Lee sends his cavalry around behind to attack Pope's rear and was able to raid Pope's headquarters, taking the federal payroll, taking the battle plans, and I think the coup de grace was he also took Pope's dress coat. So just kind of a sort of an insult. I'm not only going to take your money, your battle plans, but I'm going to take your coat as well. Lee also sent Jackson around Pope's army, capturing federal supplies at Manassas Junction. And I'll show you a picture of the map showing that in a moment. This is a painting of Generals Lee. See, here's Lee, Longstreet, Jackson, and Stewart. Now, usually you can find Stewart because he has a plume in his hat, but unless that's Stewart, it's hard to tell. Most of the Southern generals have beards. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish them. But they're discussing what to do. And so, as I said, Jackson was sent around to the flank around Pope's lines to capture several important places there at Manassas Junction, captured supplies, and then attacked Pope's lines. As Pope was about to attack Jackson, Lee's army came crashing down on the Federal flank. On the second day of battle, Federal assaults were cut down by Southern defenders, and then the Southerners counterattacked with the first time we have indicated a piercing rebel yell. Now, people try to describe this yell. It was a scream. It was something that sounded unearthly, as all these men are screaming as they're coming at, and kind of unnerved the Union soldiers when they heard the Southerners yelling as they were being attacked. On this map, we can see what we've just been saying. So here's Lee, the Confederate forces. Pope is attacking here. Jackson has gone around the edge and captured supplies, and then attacked Pope. Pope counterattacks here, and then Lee's able to attack this direction. In the meantime, Stuart has been able to go around behind. Here's a look at sort of a topographical map. You can see there are roads here, so they use roads whenever they can. Here is Bull Run back here. Here's a more modern picture of Bull Run. Let's see, you get the outcome. I didn't give you yet. This was a Confederate victory, and it sent Pope reeling back to Washington. And with this, Lee had cleared practically all of Virginia of Federal forces. So Lincoln, dissatisfied with Pope, replaced him with McClellan once again. McClellan had been in charge, and he was dismissed, and now he's back again. Well, having been successful at getting Federal troops largely out of Virginia, Lee now is focused on how can we win this war. And there are a couple things that are necessary if Lee is going to win. One way is to get the North and the Northern people to not want to fight anymore. Secondly, is to try to show foreign nations that the Confederate States are a legitimate nation and deserve their support, to try to get foreign aid. Those two things Lee thinks he can accomplish by attacking up into the North. It'll scare the Northerners, it'll scare people to say, let's not fight anymore, and if he's successful, it might bring some other country, especially they're looking at France, in on their side. All right, so he's on his way north. And oh, by the way, this also would take pressure off of Richmond. If Lee is on the move north, then the Union armies can't be attacking Richmond. They're going to have to move to protect the North. So Lee is intent on invading the North. So in September, he crossed the Potomac River into Maryland. And even with that move, he's hoping to disrupt the transportation and communication systems to Washington and gain federal assistance for the Confederacy from another country. He hoped that the U.S. government would be panicked by his move and say, let's have peace. On the way, his troops passed through Frederick, Maryland. And this is where the famous Barbara Fritchie episode takes place, which is pictured here. How many of you have ever read the story of Barbara Fritchie? Of course not. It's poetry. And nobody reads poetry anymore, do they? Have you ever heard of John Greenleaf Whittier? Okay. He wrote this poem about an event that supposedly took place in Frederick, Maryland. And I would like to read it to you. I'll have it up here so you can follow along. This was, according to Whittier, was written in strict conformity to the account of the incident as he had it from respectable and trustworthy sources. All right, so Barbara Fritchie was not a myth. She was a real person, and supposedly this really happened. This is how it reads. Up from the meadows, rich with corn, clear in the cool September morn, the clustered spires of Frederick stand, green-walled by the hills of Maryland. Okay, what do you think he means there by the clustered spires? What he's talking about is you're coming up over the hill. Frederick is up in the mountains, and you're coming up over the hill, and you see Frederick for the first time. He says you see clustered spires. What are spires? Not exactly.
Like torches?
No. Something tall, sticking up from buildings. What kind of buildings? Churches, church steeples. All right. So, and there are a lot of church, and you can still, well, the last time I was there, you could still see church spires. That area has grown up a lot in the last 20, 30 years. and green walled by the hills. You know, it's Frederick is in a valley with mountains all around, beautiful area, and so it's green all around. So it's a very picturesque way of putting what the Confederate soldiers would have seen as they're coming into Frederick. Round about them orchards sweep, apple and peach tree fruited deep. Remember, this is in August, so it's harvest time. Fair is the garden of the Lord to the eyes of the famished rebel horde. On that pleasant morn of the early fall, when Lee marched over the mountain wall, over the mountains winding down, horse and foot into Frederick town. 40 flags with their silver stars, 40 flags with their crimson bars, flapped in the morning wind. The sun of noon looked down and saw not one. Up rose old Barbara Fritchie then, bowed with her 80 years and 10. So how old is she? How much is the score? 20. Yeah, so 80 and 10 would be what? She's 90 years old. Bravest of all in Frederick town. She took up the flag the men hauled down. Now remember, what kind of a state is Maryland here? What is Maryland's position in this conflict? They're a border state. Called that because they're on the border between North and South. They're technically in the South, aren't they? Because they're below the Mason-Dixon line, which was the line of demarcation. Was Maryland a slave state or a free state? A slave state. It was a slave state. And might have voted to secede if Lincoln hadn't sent troops to their legislature to prevent that. All right, so she's in a slave state, largely sympathetic to the South, but not entirely. There are people in Maryland that are not sympathetic to the South, and she is one that is more sympathetic to the Union. So she says she took up the flag the men hauled down. Apparently, she had an American flag, and some men took it down with the Confederate troops coming into town. You don't want to antagonize them, right? She doesn't care. In her attic window, the staff she set to show that one heart was loyal yet. Up the street came the rebel tread. Stonewall Jackson riding ahead. Under his slouched hat, left and right, he glanced. The old flag met his sight. Halt! The dust-brown ranks stood fast. Fire! Outblasted the rifle blast.
Okay.
It shivered the windows, pane and sash. It rent the banner with seam and gash. So they fired into that flag. Quick as it fell from the broken staff, Dame Barbara snatched the silken scarf. She leaned far out on the windowsill and shook it forth with a royal will. Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag, she said. A shade of sadness, a blush of shame, over the face of the leader came. The nobler nature within him stirred to life at that woman's deed and word. Who touches a hair of yon gray head dies like a dog. March on, he said. All day long through Frederick Street sounded the tread of marching feet. All day long that free flag tossed over the heads of the rebel host. Ever its torn folds rose and fell on the loyal winds that loved it well. And through the hill gaps sunset light shone over it with a warm good night. Barbara Fritchie's work is o'er, and the rebel rides on his raids no more. Honor to her, and let a tear fall for her sake on Stonewall's bier. What is that? What is a bier? I said it the wrong tier. What is a bier? B-I-E-R. The grave. Over Barbara Fritchie's grave, Flag of freedom and union wave, peace and order and beauty draw, round thy symbol of light and law. And ever the stars above look down on thy stars below in Fredericktown. So this was a very famous poem, read in all schools one time or another, and presents an interesting story of what may have happened as the Confederate troops came through Frederick, Maryland. Well, the troops went through, the Confederate troops, and the Union's army doesn't know where Lee is going exactly. They're kind of following along at a pace apart from them, following along behind them. A Union Army observer estimated that at least 3,000 of 64,000 Confederate troops that moved through Frederick were fully armed and equipped, many on horseback. So he's presenting this army as a large army and well equipped. But something happened that might have turned things. On a campsite near Frederick on September 13th, a Union private came upon where the Confederate army had been camping, and he found in the ashes of the fire there 3 cigars wrapped in papers. And when they unwrapped the papers, it turned out that these were Lee's orders to one of his generals. It outlined what they were going to do. So it's like having the battle plan of the enemy. When McClellan was given this, he boasted that with this discovered battle plan, he said, quote, "If I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." In other words, here's all I need. Now I know what he's doing, and I should be able to whip him. Well, Lee quickly drew up a defensive line of 30,000 at Antietam Creek, near Sharpsburg, Maryland, waiting for McClellan's 87,000 to attack. And at dawn, September 17th, Union forces launched an attack on the Confederate line. There were 40 acres, as you can see here. We got a little too much sunlight and maybe reflecting on here, but this is a cornfield. It's still there, still is a cornfield, and it was back then. And of course, in September, the corn is ripe. So you've got corn out there with ripened ears, ready to be picked. And as the Union Army came up across, I don't know if you can see, this is a hill here. They come up over the hill, and as they come up over the hill, they saw that there were Confederate troops on the other side of this cornfield. And they began to engage them. And they began firing back and forth. Initially, as the Union soldiers were on this side of the cornfield, they could look down the rows of corn. You ever been in a cornfield? You can look down a straight row and you can see at the other end. And so they would see soldiers. So they're firing down that way. I once did that when I was hunting many years ago. My dad and I and another guy were hunting rabbits. And we were in this cornfield. The corn was down by then, but some of the stalks were still up. And I was really fortunate that day. I was kind of standing in one spot, maybe from one place to another in this cornfield, and looking down a row. And every once in a while, a rabbit would come and stop at the other end. It wasn't a big cornfield. At the other end of the row, and just sit there. Just shoot him, you know. And either go down to another row, and another one will come and stop. This happened to me 2 or 3 times, maybe more that day. They kept stopping right at the end of the row. Well, that's what these guys are looking down the row, and they're seeing soldiers. They're just firing right down there. Well, after a while, there were so many bullets flying, because you're not only firing down the road, you're firing anywhere that you think you might see soldiers, opposing soldiers. And there was so much fire taking place back and forth that it literally took all the corn out. So the cornfield was bare by the end of the day, just from gunfire going back and forth. One survivor wrote that the terrific fire cut down the charging soldiers like a scythe running through our line. So that's what's taking place as we look at this map in this area here. Now, one of the things that you discover if you go to battlefields is that usually they're a lot bigger than what you think. I don't know what you think of when you think of a battle, but we have a tendency to think that maybe it could take place out in the parking lot, or maybe a football field. But I went to Antietam. Anybody been to Antietam? It's a great place. They've got a really good movie they show you that explains the battle, but you drive. The Battle of Antietam took place over a large area. And so this initial encounter took place near, actually there was an encounter at a church, first of all, a Dunker church, and then this cornfield. And then there's some other parts of the battle that take place in more removed places from one another. It's really kind of spread out. The next part of the battle takes place, well, here's Dunker Church, and here's the cornfield. There are a couple other parts of the battles here. Here's the cornfield, which is pictured here as they're coming up over the hill and meeting them there. Longstreet's heavily involved there. This is a painting of Stonewall Jackson at Dunker Church. That's Dunker with a D. What do you suppose a Dunker church is? They serve donuts.
Baptist church.
Yeah, so there are people that dunk. Probably German. Dunker Church. And some fighting took place around that. And then as we move more to midday, you have some fighting at Roulette Farm, but this is a major part of the battle at what's called the Sunken Road. It would be called Bloody Lane later. And here on the map you can see where that takes place. The Confederates are dug in on this sunken road. I don't know if you've ever, we don't have this so much anymore because our roads are graded and we take away the hillsides. But if you've ever been out in the country somewhere on an old country road, a road that's been traveled a lot, that hasn't been upgraded, you might find that when people travel on an old country road a lot, especially a dirt road, that it keeps getting lower and lower as people are traveling, and the sides get higher and higher. Well, that's the way this road was. It was called Sunken Road because there was the kind of walls of the road went up on either side. So if you're walking along the road, you're walking below the surface of the field beside you. And so this was a great place for the Confederates to put themselves because they could be standing on this road, and the level of the field beside them is just about the right place to stand there and hold a rifle, and you could be shooting at the enemy coming, and you're protected because you're down below the surface, and they're up on the surface, you see? So that was a good place to be. Until some Union troops got around behind and got on higher ground where they could look down on the sunken road. Then what do you suppose happened? Now they're in a higher position than the people on the sunken road. They're on a hill nearby, and they're able to fire down into the sunken road. And now the Confederate soldiers down there have no protection at all. Whereas they were protected before when they're looking one direction, from the other direction, now they're like, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. They're just totally open. And the Federal soldiers just bombard them and kill many, many men there. So that sunken road became known as Bloody Lane because there were so many people dead in that road. Here is a picture taken after the battle. So you can see that there, in addition to being sunken, there's a wall here. So the Confederates were able to do well facing this way. But when the Union troops got on this side and a higher place were able to fire down at them, it was a death trap. Well, that's not the end of the battle. There's the next stage of the battle takes place at this bridge. The Confederate soldiers are on this side of the bridge, the Union on this side. And the Union is trying to get across the bridge in order to attack the Confederate soldiers. This painting is by John Paul Strain. This comes to be called Burnside Bridge because that's the name of the general that leads the attack by the Union. His name is General Ambrose Burnside. This shows his movement. trying to get across Antietam Creek. Here's a picture taken not long after that of the Burnside Bridge. It's in the afternoon from 1 p.m. to 5:30 p.m. Now what happens, and there's Burnside, by the way, notice this. Because he had these whiskers, didn't have a beard, but had these big whiskers, somebody had the idea of turning his name around and calling these sideburns. That's where the name comes from, sideburn from Burnside. Here are the Union forces trying to get across that bridge. Let's see if I have. Let's go back to this picture. Over on this side, there's a hill, and they're looking down on the bridge. So it only didn't take very many Confederate soldiers on that hill to keep the Union soldiers from coming across. The bridge is not very wide, and so anybody tries to come across the bridge, they're just picking them off. So they keep trying and trying, and they can't get across. They keep losing more men. Meanwhile, Burnside is getting a little upset because McClellan promised him that if he needed more troops, that McClellan had some in reserve that he would send, but he never did. McClellan had a number of troops that never even got into the battle, and Burnside could have used them. But eventually Burnside did come across. He was able to finally push his way across just by sheer numbers of men and put these rebels on the run. But as Burnside was progressing on the other side of the bridge, then all of a sudden there showed up A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill had marched his men all night in order to get there, and they got there that afternoon. And with the arrival of A.P. Hill, who is pictured here, they were able to not only stop the Federal troops, but actually push them back across the bridge. So all that afternoon, Burnside had tried to capture that bridge and actually got pushed back across it. Now this is a scene that takes place earlier in the day when they finally were able to get across, and in part because of whiskey. A portion of the troops, the ones from Pennsylvania, had their whiskey rations taken away because they had been unruly during the previous march, and so they asked if they would have their whiskey ration given back if they could take the bridge. And Colonel said, yeah, that they could. And so that gave them the impetus to storm the bridge and get across, because if they did, they could have their whiskey. Well, at the end of the day, 24,000 men have been killed. This is the bloodiest day in American history. And it's remembered for that, and you should remember for that. The bloodiest day in American history. In that evening, you can see here pictured, General Lee assembled his key commanders outside his headquarters tent to discuss whether they should stay and continue to fight or whether they should retreat. Stephen?
Don't people usually talk more about Gettysburg being the bloodiest battle?
It was, that was over 3 days. This is the bloodiest one day.
Okay.
Pictured here with Lee is, and I think I have them right, Stonewall Jackson sitting here, D.H. Hill, James Longstreet, John Bell Hood, Jubal Early, A.P. Hill, who has just been a hero in this battle, and D.H. Jones. Some of these we'll hear from later. So Lee and his generals decided, we'll stay. We're going to stay and battle it out. And they were prepared for another attack, but McClellan did not attack. McClellan declined. And since McClellan wasn't attacking, Lee wasn't going to attack him. He didn't have the forces to do that. And so Lee quietly slipped his army back across the Potomac into Virginia. Now, technically, the outcome of this battle was a Union victory because the Confederates had withdrawn. But in reality, it was a draw. No one really won the battle. But because the Confederates had left the field, they quit, you know, if you will, so the Union could claim a victory that they needed very badly because the Confederates were mostly whipping them in the Eastern Theater. And Lincoln needed a victory because he wanted to do something to change the context of the war and to keep foreign nations from interfering on the side of the Confederacy. And that is, he wanted an opportunity to announce an Emancipation Proclamation. And he couldn't do that if they were just losing all the time. So even though this wasn't really a victory, Lincoln claimed it as a victory so that in victory he could issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln himself stated that the proclamation was primarily a war measure to encourage a slave revolt in the South. The Emancipation Proclamation was discussed by his cabinet for some time. Here's how the South reacted to it. Take off the mask of Lincoln, and what do you have? Can you see? The devil. Here's how the North reacted. With Lady Liberty riding through the streets of Washington. Liberty to all. Well, let's take a quick look. See, do we have time to take a quick look, very quick, at the Emancipation Proclamation? Hopefully you can see that well enough to read. Let's see. Here's the date. Proclamation issued by the President of the United States. First day of January, 1863. All persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then thenceforward and forever free. So, where did the emancipation free slaves? That's the question. Where did Lincoln say slaves were free? Notice the limitations. Within any state or part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion. So in other words, the locations where slaves were declared to be free was anywhere where the United States didn't have control, where the people were still rebellion. So any parts that the Union Army had controlled, had put down the rebellion, so to speak, slaves weren't freed there. They were declared to be free only in areas of rebellion. Not free in border states, not free anywhere where the Union had control. All right? So, and it goes on to talk about the details there. So when people say that Lincoln, in the Emancipation Proclamation, freed the slaves, how accurate is that? The only slaves he proclaimed to be free were in areas over which he had no control to actually free them. You see that? I'm amused every year when I see celebrations on January 1st of the Emancipation Proclamation, because that's when the slaves were free. No, they weren't. They weren't freed until a constitutional amendment was passed that actually freed the slaves. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation didn't literally free anybody. If you have questions about that, we'll come back tomorrow and talk about it.